On the morning of October 12, 1492, the sun rose over a small island in the Bahamas, illuminating a collision that would shatter the timeline of human history. On the white sands stood the Taíno, a people of the Arawak language family, whose ancestors had navigated the Caribbean for centuries in massive hand-carved cedar canoes. They were a civilization of complex social hierarchies, profound spirituality, and a caloric equilibrium perfectly tuned to their island environment. Watching them from the deck of a creaking, salt-crusted Spanish carrack was a man driven by desperation, religious fervor, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the planet's geography. Christopher Columbus did not know he had arrived at the edge of two vast continents. He did not know that his presence would act as a biological and cultural fuse, igniting a firestorm that would consume 90% of the indigenous population within a single century. This was not merely a discovery. This was the moment the Old World and the New World, separated for 10,000 years by rising oceans, crashed into one another with the violence of a collapsing star. To understand the brutality that followed, we must first understand the machine that sent him. Europe in 1492 was not a powerhouse, it was a cornered animal. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had severed the ancient Silk Roads to the east. The Ottoman Empire held the keys to the spice trade, strangling the economies of Christendom. Venice and Genoa were bleeding wealth, paying exorbitant taxes for the pepper, cloves, and silk that the European elite craved. There was a geopolitical asphyxiation happening. Europe needed a bypass surgery. Into this desperation stepped Christopher Columbus, a Genoese wool weaver turned maritime visionary. He was a man of intense contradictions, a self-taught scholar who devoured Marco Polo's travels, yet severely miscalculated the circumference of the Earth. He believed the world was 25% smaller than it actually was. He argued that the ocean sea was a narrow canal separating Spain from the gold-roofed palaces of Japan. He spent years peddling this geopolitical gambit to the monarchs of Portugal, England, and France. They all laughed at him, not because they thought the world was flat. Every educated person knew it was round, but because their mathematicians knew Columbus was wrong about the distance. They knew a ship would run out of food and water long before reaching Asia. But in Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were different. They had just completed the Reconquista, an 800-year holy war to drive Islamic rule from the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was a society forged in the fires of crusading violence. They possessed a military-religious complex that needed a new outlet. When Columbus knelt before them, promising gold to fund the recapture of Jerusalem, they didn't see a geographer. They saw a divine instrument. The voyage itself was a masterclass in psychological logistics. Departing in August 1492, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria sailed into the Sea of Darkness. For 33 days, they saw nothing but the endless, maddening blue of the Atlantic. Modern historians often gloss over the mutiny point. By early October, the crew was not just grumbling, they were actively plotting to throw Columbus overboard. They had passed the point of no return. Their food supplies, hard biscuits infested with weevils, and wine turning into vinegar were dwindling. Columbus survived only by deception. He kept 2 logbooks, a real log with the true distance traveled, and a fake log that showed a shorter distance to calm the terrified crew. He was managing a morale supply chain that was seconds away from snapping. On the night of October 11th, a faint light was spotted. The next morning, the impossible happened: land. But the tragedy began instantly. Columbus didn't see a new culture to learn from. His journal entries from that very first day reveal a chilling commercial assessment. He wrote of the Taíno, "They should be good servants and of quick intelligence. I believe that they would be easily made Christians, for it appeared to me that they had no creed." He noted the gold rings in their noses and asked, through sign language, where the gold came from. They pointed south. In that moment, the exploration mission became an extraction mission. The true pivot point of history occurred on Christmas Eve, 1492. The flagship, Santa Maria, arguably the most famous ship in history, was wrecked not by a storm, but by incompetence. An exhausted helmsman handed the tiller to a cabin boy who promptly drove the heavy ship onto a coral reef off the coast of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti. The ship was torn apart. Columbus, seeing this as a sign from God, used the timber to build the first European structure in the Americas, a fortress named La Navidad, the Nativity. This is where the relationship with the indigenous leader Guacanaragus becomes crucial. Guacanaragus was a powerful cacique, chief, who treated Columbus with royal hospitality, weeping when the ship was lost and ordering his people to help salvage the cargo. He saw the Spanish as potential allies against his own rivals, the Caribs. Columbus, misinterpreting this kindness as submission, left 39 men behind at La Navidad with orders to trade for gold. He then limped back to Spain on the Niña to report his success. When he arrived in Barcelona, he didn't just bring gold. He brought kidnapped Taíno people, parrots, and strange new plants. He spun a narrative of a terrestrial paradise filled with docile labor and endless wealth. The monarchs were mesmerized. The investment engine of the Spanish crown roared to life. The second voyage was no longer a mission of discovery. It was an invasion fleet. In September 1493, Columbus returned not with 3 rickety boats, but with 17 ships and 1,200 men. This was the Mayflower on steroids. He brought soldiers, priests, craftsmen, horses, pigs, and attack dogs. He came to build an empire. But when the fleet pulled into the harbor of La Navidad, silence greeted them. The fortress was burned to the ground. The 39 men were dead, their bodies rotting in the sun, eyes gouged out. The truth emerged slowly. The men Columbus left behind had not been saints. They had roamed the island, raping women and stealing gold, violating the social contract of the Taíno. A rival chief, Cayo, had descended from the mountains and wiped them out. The mask of the peaceful explorer fell away. Columbus, enraged and under pressure to pay back his royal investors, initiated a reign of terror. He established the tribute system. Every Taíno over the age of 14 was required to fill a hawk's bell with gold dust every 3 months. Those who failed had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death as a warning to others. This was the birth of the encomienda, a system of legalized slavery disguised as protection. The Spanish viewed the indigenous body as a unit of energy to be consumed for the extraction of mineral wealth. The caloric logistics of the island shifted from sustainable agriculture to forced mining. Thousands of Taíno committed mass suicide with cassava poison to escape the dogs and the swords. Women ceased having children. The social fabric of a 3,000-year-old culture unraveled in less than a decade. But the sword was inefficient compared to the invisible killer. The 17 ships of the second voyage carried an unseen passenger, the influenza virus, and likely smallpox soon after. The biological wall that had protected the Americas was breached. You must understand the scale of this. In Europe, people lived in close quarters with domesticated animals, cows, pigs, sheep, for millennia, building up immunity to zoonotic diseases. The Taíno had no such history. They were biologically naive. When the virus hit, it didn't just kill the weak, it killed the strong. It killed the caciques who organized the harvest. It killed the elders who held the oral history. It killed the parents who cared for the children. This was a societal decapitation. The structure of Taíno life collapsed. Fields went unplanted. Famine followed the plague. The population of Hispaniola, estimated by some scholars to be as high as several million in 1492, dropped to fewer than 30,000 by 1514. By 1550, the Taíno as a distinct cultural entity were effectively extinct. This great dying paved the way for the transatlantic slave trade. As the indigenous workforce died off, the Spanish looked to Africa to replace the labor, initiating the second great tragedy of the era. Columbus himself was not immune to the chaos he created. He was a brilliant sailor, but a catastrophic governor. The Spanish settlers, suffering from disease and disappointed by the lack of easy gold, rebelled against him. They viewed him as a foreign tyrant. In 1500, a royal investigator, Francisco de Bobadilla, was sent to Hispaniola. He was so horrified by the sight of Spanish corpses hanging from the gallows, Columbus's preferred method of discipline, that he arrested the admiral. The man who discovered a world was returned to Spain in chains. Although he would make 2 more voyages, dying in 1506, still insisting he had found Asia, the world had moved on. The map had changed. The Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the planet between Spain and Portugal. The colonial machine was now bigger than any one man. The artifacts of this collision are still with us. We speak Spanish in Mexico because of 1492. We eat potatoes in Ireland and tomatoes in Italy because of this biological exchange. We live in the wreckage and the wonder of the world Columbus accidentally forged. If this deep dive into the dark origins of the American story opened your eyes, please subscribe to History Unlocked. We are building the most comprehensive visual history library on YouTube, and we can't do it without you. Next time, we move further north to explore the expansion of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, focusing on the colonization of Florida and the rugged frontiers of the Southwest. You do not want to miss it. Stay tuned.